So good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me on this session. My name is Tom Scase. I'm one of the senior solutions engineers at BeyondTrust. And today we're going to go through some of the myths associated with privileged access management. First of all, we're going to delve into a bit about data breaches. So, how and why they're occurring, look at the attack vectors and some of the weaknesses. We're going to look into the typical IT environment of today and look how it actually could be improved. We're going to talk about the privileged access management and, more importantly, some of the myths associated to those. And finally, we're going to go into having a look at the BeyondTrust portfolio, and at the end of the session, I'm going to go through a bit of a demonstration. So it's probably going to be about 25 minutes of running through some slides and then hopefully 20 minutes of the demonstration. Now, while we've not seen such huge widespread attacks in 2019 like we did within 2018 with the likes of NotPetya and WannaCry, we have seen a significant rise in the amount of data breaches. Now, whether that be where we're buying our donuts and our coffee, the airlines that we're using to fly to events like this, or where we're going for healthcare, data breaches have risen over 58% since last year. And these data breaches, they're not cheap, with the average global cost of a data breach costing close to $4 million. They're also very difficult to contain as well, with the hackers remaining within networks for approximately 10 months. And over that time, they're stealing tens of thousands of records each and every time. And is it a surprise that these breaches are on the rise and so difficult to detect when McAfee Labs' threat report says that there's over 750 new malware samples identified every day? And if people were in Sammy's session this morning, he's looking at a different figure there, saying it's 1 million a day, but even the sum of 750,000 a day, it seems ridiculous, but that's the figures from McAfee Labs on the latest reports. In Q1 of 2019, there was over 67 million identified, and that's the new samples. So how is your AV actually going to keep up with that volume of threats? And this attack surface is growing. We know that the world of IT is changing and evolving exponentially. And from speaking to people in similar roles to yourselves, we know that the risk associated to IT is also growing exponentially in parallel. And we know that the threat actors are looking to get privileged access to systems, but gone are the days where organizations can maintain full control over their privileged accounts. And that's because there's tens of thousands of privileged accounts across tens of thousands of privileged accounts across thousands of assets. And those may be on-prem devices, cloud-based devices, Internet of Things, and across DevOps. So our customers are telling us that this attack surface is becoming harder and harder to maintain on a day-to-day basis. So where do these privileged accounts actually sit within your environment? Well, first of all, we've probably got the people that we call the app stewards. Maybe they're vendors, maybe your application developers. We also have database administrators, and those database admins may actually be local administrators on their desktops, so on their laptops or desktops that they log onto on a day-to-day basis. But they also obviously have privileged accounts within the SQL databases. So they have access to SA accounts, etc. in there. So there's privileged accounts on their logon accounts, or maybe also within SQL as well. We can also, it's quite easy to forget the non-privileged users that are using non-traditional privileged accounts as well. So think of things such as social media accounts. Think of what the reputational damage that could happen if someone got access to the company Twitter account, for instance. And also, it's easy to forget the help desk. These guys access any network machine at any time. They make configuration changes. They support our end users. They have privileged accounts on their endpoints because they need to perform privileged operations and make changes to their systems and update their systems. And these are all these accounts are at risk if they're misused or abused. So what is the actual impact if we do nothing about these privileged accounts? Well, we're basically making the lives much simpler for the hackers. 9 out of 10 breaches are associated to admin rights. So if you take away admin rights, Sammy was advocating this earlier today, take away admin rights, you neutralize 90% of those attacks. 8 out of 10 breaches are caused by the malicious insider. So that's an actual employee that has an overprivileged account, maybe taking advantage of those excessive privileges. There's a similar percentage of these breaches that start with a stolen or guessed weak password. And nearly 2/3 of companies have got no way of actually monitoring any of this activity. So why is this privileged account such an issue? Well, a hacker's goal is to compromise one of these privileged accounts, preferably one that doesn't have its password changed, either password changed ever, or it's not it's not part of the password policy for rotation. They're typically seen as being always on accounts, the ones that may be forgotten about, the service accounts, the non-human accounts, not necessarily one that someone is logging onto, but maybe a service that's running within a privileged account out there. And once those accounts have been compromised, the hackers are going to try and gain administrative or root privilege. And once they do, they can execute an exploit on an asset, gain a foothold onto the network, and ultimately start to exfiltrate data. And why are they targeting these attack vectors? Well, they give them the highest chance of a successful breach. The compromised account is always active. It's typically not monitored for any kind of inappropriate activity. They're highly privileged, so these can access critical and non-critical systems. And these systems themselves that we're now gaining access to will also have additional identities on them, additional accounts that can also be used in an attack. So what actually happens then if your current password management solution doesn't address these types of attack vectors? Well, maybe your privileged credentials are either completely unmanaged or maybe just poorly managed. Maybe they're written down on a spreadsheet. Maybe some of those username and passwords are actually reused across multiple systems, multiple devices, and then obviously making you even more vulnerable to attack. What do we do with the level of access of these privileged accounts? Do you give everybody domain administrator privileges so that you're not restricting them from what they can do in their day-to-day job? No limitation to that account so they can be productive. Are you also giving third parties active directory accounts and then giving them a VPN and then just trusting that when they're in the network, they're not going to go to other parts of the network that they can actually access? And when it comes to user experience, this lack of process is going to start to impede their productivity. So if you do get breached, what does this then lead to? Obviously, we've got to be concerned with brand and reputational damage. And some companies out there actually care about this a lot more than they care about the fines for the breach. A good example of that, if you think of the banks, especially the banks in the UK, they're actually, the amounts it would cost them for a fine because of a breach and how that actually compares to the amount of money that they're actually paying out for PPI claims, for instance, is going to be a fraction of that. It's going to be a drop in the water for them. And once we are compromised, things are going to stop working correctly. We're actually going to reduce the operational efficiency of the business. And ultimately, someone is going to be held responsible for this. And that's going to typically fall on the CISO or the CIO, whoever is actually responsible for that data. And one other big risk to businesses are low trust endpoints. a lot of businesses adopt this browse-up security model, where you actually connect to and administer assets from a low-trust machine, a low-trust device, that are at higher risk of being compromised. An example of that could just be somebody's home computer. I'm remotely connecting to our company assets from my home machine. And what is it that actually makes these devices low trust? Well, typically I'm logging onto that endpoint as a local administrator, which will increase the risk of me accidentally installing some malware onto that machine. I'm also typically accessing email from this device as well, so there's a higher risk of becoming a victim to spear phishing attacks. And if this attacker is able to compromise your management device, then there's a good chance that they can start to move laterally to more critical assets. Now, this browse-up model is bad practice, but it's sometimes, or it's often used by employees that are demanding admin rights on their machines. So if you think of people like developers, engineers, even the IT teams, they say, I need to have admin rights in order to achieve my job. So this is typically why they're using this browse-up security model. And also it makes IT's life a lot simpler if they're trying to administer or support remote workers if they are local administrators on their machines. So the alternative to that model is the browse-down security. Now, browse-down is a great security model, and it is best practice to mitigate the risks in the environment. But the issue is it's not achievable by most businesses today. The endpoints are far too locked down for the users to remain productive. And if you think of remote workers, for instance, what are we going to do? Are we going to give them a secondary device for them to carry around and ask them to connect to an isolated VPN? The best case scenario is that they're going to connect to a virtual machine that's on the network whilst connected to a VPN and just hope that they're not going to browse any further or misuse that connection. The NCSC also agreed that browse-up model is bad practice and the browse-down security model alone is too restrictive, but they suggest that a combination of browse-down along with privileged access management can actually make it a reality. And that's also why Gartner are telling us that privileged access management should be the #1 project this year for security and risk management leaders to be focusing on and implementing. And that's actually covering the human accounts, like the actual user logon accounts, but also non-human accounts also. And that includes the services, app-to-app accounts also. And that's for supporting on-premise, cloud, hybrid platforms, and also APIs for automation. So what benefits does privileged access management give you? Well, now you're going to get all of your privileged accounts managed in a single platform. You can now provide secure and flexible remote access to your third parties, giving them only access to the assets that they need to be able to administer. You get full visibility of the privileged access, including session recording, and that's both on video recording and keystrokes. And now users have an experience that's not going to slow them down. So this is great, so why is everybody not implementing a privileged access management solution then? And that may be down to some of these PAM myths that I'm going to run through right now. The first one is that the zero trust model is achievable, and I think maybe that's a little bit harsh. Maybe it should be that this is easily achievable. Now, we're not saying that it's not a good model to work towards. It absolutely is, but it's not going to deliver instant results. If we think of securing the network, it's typically very complicated. If we look at the software-defined networking, it's considered hard to deploy, hard to operate, and hard to debug. Software-defined firewalls, you typically get a performance penalty, and the identities are locked to an IP address. And then with zero trust, here you can assign an identity to an application or a service, but this is where we're going to get certificate distribution and authorization access controls, and that's where they start to become the problem. And this is another big myth that to enable privileged access management, you must move to shared accounts. So this is asking you to change the way that your sysadmins work today. So most organizations use dedicated admin accounts along with that user's standard logon account. So for example, here I've just put one up there. I log on to let's say I'm one of the sysadmins at BeyondTrust. I log on to my laptop as a standard user with my Scase account. But then when I maybe log on to other assets, if I need to perform some privileged operations on some servers, I will have my own dedicated secondary account, which is tscase.adm, and that's my privileged account. So with this model, with the dedicated admin account model, we've got the accountability. So they know that it was me that logged onto that server that performed that operation, so we've got that from an auditing perspective. It's more secure because it's my password. I know what the password is. It's known only by me. It's not shared with anybody else. And I have the right level of access for my account. It's been tailored for my role. And it's much easier to integrate with IAM. So what are the problem with shared accounts then? Well, there are also lots of issues associated to shared accounts. You could spend a lot of money in consultancy moving and converting to this model if you already have that dedicated admin accounts model. If it is a shared credential and lots of people need access to that credential, they also need to have access to that shared password. So where do we then store that password? How is that secured for that shared account? It's obviously then going to be difficult to audit. You know, who was actually using that shared account at the time when that system was rebooted, for instance. And because these shared accounts are shared by multiple people with multiple roles, these privileged credentials, these privileged accounts, are typically given excessive privileges so that no one is restricted independent of whatever they need to do as part of their role. So that's typically where they're given the domain admin credential when it's not necessarily needed. And myth number 3, that privileged account management, privileged access management is only managing privileged accounts. Now, if that was the case, we'd all still be at risk to these types of attack. You know, hackers don't need to target a privileged account to execute ransomware. You know, ransomware targets content. I, as a standard user, if I execute a piece of ransomware on my machine, that can run and execute under the context of a standard user and go and encrypt all my data. I don't need to be running as a privileged admin account for that type of attack to happen. And obviously, the spear phishing, you know, I don't need to be an administrator to accidentally click on a link and put my credentials into a fake website where my credentials are then stolen. So it's not just about managing privileged accounts. Privileged accounts are absolutely kind of the tip of the iceberg. But what about securing those remote access pathways for the third parties and the service providers? What about reducing the attack surface of those desktops and servers by taking away the actual admin rights from the people that are accessing them? And then even reducing the attack surface even more by implementing whitelists. So this morning, Sammy was advocating the use of AppLocker. Whitelisting is a great way of actually reducing that attack surface even more. And the vulnerability management, you know, I don't need a privileged credential if I can exploit a vulnerability. Now that said, securing privileged accounts can absolutely be seen as a massive, a quick win to actually reduce that risk in an organization. Myth number 4, privileged access management only helps you manage and control Active Directory. So how many of you here have actually only have Windows assets in your environment? You know, we're seeing Macs being used by end users more and more. We've got Linux servers in our data center. We've got DevOps that are growing rapidly. And remote access from mobile devices is increasing year on year. So it's absolutely not just Windows devices and Active Directory. And number 5, the vendor access can be secured using a VPN. You know, do you trust your external vendors, your third parties, like you do your employees? If you do, you probably shouldn't. Do they need always on access that the VPN provides? Why don't we just give them what they want access to and when they need it? And even kind of complementing that, why don't we give the capability to actually shadow those third parties whilst they are accessing? Shadow and assist them with the sessions and enable multiple layers of approval for that access, and get full audit trail along the way. And myth number 6, the final one, privileged access management requires a big IT team and effort to implement and manage. Now this is quite an important one because there's quite a lot of vendors out there that may be telling you this as one of their, they're actually stating it as a fact, as they know it takes a lot of their consultancy time and effort and cost to get their solution up and running. And it's not just about getting it up and running, but it's the continued cost of maintaining and upgrading that technology and that solution that needs to be added to that initial purchase price. Now, luckily, this needn't be the case. Automation is key here. If you can start to automate the onboarding of assets, the onboarding of the privileged accounts that may exist on those assets, you can massively reduce that management overhead. You can also work with the skilled partners. Let's not forget about the partners that the vendors work with. They can assist you in these projects. And maybe start with some of those quick wins first. You don't actually have to go and take on board all of your privileged accounts, all of these different layers of concern. Maybe we do just look at that low-hanging fruit, those high-risk accounts, the dedicated admin accounts. Let's onboard those and manage those first of all. And also, you can take advantage of the out-of-the-box policies that enable you to get things moving quickly. For instance, we can enable you to remove local admin rights across your organization overnight. And I'm actually have another session later this afternoon to show you how we can do that. So just a bit of a summary, let's go for these quick wins. You do need a solution that's going to cover all platforms. So not just Windows, but also Windows, Linux, Mac OS, network devices. There's high-risk privileged accounts across more than just Active Directory and Windows machines. Let's target those high-risk accounts and dedicated admins initially. Automatic and continuous discovery and onboarding of new accounts and assets is key. We can actually automate this, set a policy first and once, and then we're constantly onboarding new assets that join the network, new privileged accounts that fall into Active Directory. And we can easily fix the vendor access issue with secure remote access. Immediately take away that risk of external vendors and third parties accessing the network. We can secure that very quickly, and we can reduce the attack surface on the endpoint. So the endpoint itself, whether it be a desktop, whether it be a server, let's take away the local admin rights from the connecting accounts, and also we can implement whitelisting across the board. So to achieve this, we need a portfolio of products, a portfolio of a privileged access management solution. We have a privileged password and session management product where we discover, manage, and audit those privileged accounts and sessions. We have endpoint privilege management across Windows, Mac, and Linux. We can secure the remote access with our secure remote access product for both third-party point of view, but also internally for the service desk. The service desk are internal. They access people's endpoints to support them, and they usually do that privileged, and that same technology can give benefits to the service desk as well. We have the vulnerability management to identify and remediate vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the perimeter and the endpoints, and we also have change auditing technology as well. So why choose BeyondTrust? Well, we're ranked as a leader by both Gartner and Forrester. We believe that we do have the broadest portfolio covering all of the areas of privileged access management, and we've got 20,000 customers across 80 countries that are benefiting from using those. But I think importantly, as well as the investment in BeyondTrust, we're also integrating with your existing investments. So we've got a number of different types of integrations there, from the service managements with the ServiceNows, Ivanti, the cloud integrations, identity and access management. You know, these investments that you've already put your money into, you know, we can also start to integrate with those workflows, etc. So I think that's enough of the slides. I think I'm doing quite well for time, so we've still got about 20 minutes, so I thought I'd go into a bit of a demonstration of the privileged access management products. Let me just duplicate my screen. Excellent, okay. So we're going to run through two scenarios, one from the end user experience point of view from one of the sysadmins that wants to gain access to a privileged asset. So I'm going to be Tom Scase, one of the sysadmins, and I'm just logging onto my laptop as a standard user. I don't have any privileges on this machine. So the only account that I need to know a password for is my standard user account. So I've logged into my laptop. Now, previously, I may have remotely connected with the remote desktop tools to Linux devices, Windows devices, but I would have needed to know what the accounts and the passwords were for those privileged accounts. Now what I can do is I can log into the BeyondTrust portal. I'm logging into this BeyondTrust portal just with my standard username and password. Here we can actually integrate with MFA, so we can anything that supports Radius or SAML, we can also integrate at this point. So here I'm authorizing myself into the BeyondTrust portal. Now what happens now is I get visibility based on my role of only the assets and the privileged accounts that are associated to those assets. So here you can see that because I'm one of the third line support people or the third line sysadmins, I've got access to multiple assets, multiple privileged assets with different credentials that can be married to those assets. So here you can see I've got the domain controller where I'm using domain admin credentials. I've got some Linux endpoints where I've got access to some Linux credentials as well, or Linux privileged credentials. What we can do here is I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to connect to one of my domain controllers. Here you can see I've got different options. I could put in a request for a certain time. We have workflows, so we can actually integrate with ticketing systems, and I'll give you a demonstration of how we can integrate with the likes of ServiceNow in a moment. I could request access at a particular time. So I could put some timings in here. I could say whether I want access to a session. So BeyondTrust is actually going to proxy this session through our hardened appliance, and we're actually going to do a lot of the video recording and session recording and keystroke logging, or we could just allow the user, if you wanted to check out a privileged password. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually have the session. So here you can actually see that I can select the ticketing system, and what I'm actually going to do now is show you that we actually can do the ticket validation. So here I've actually rather than leveraging the workflow or the authorization workflow that we can actually put in place with the password safe products, we could send a request off to multiple users from a list. But in this case, let's just say that my user has already raised a ServiceNow ticket, and they're actually going to put in a ticket number to say, yes, my access to this system has actually been authorized. Now I'm purposely putting in a wrong ticket here because we do the ticket validation. So when I submit this request, the ticket number is incorrect. We'll see here that this ticket number does not exist. So I've put the wrong ticket number in, maybe again put another ticket number in. This ticket actually does exist, but it's matched to a different user. So here we're doing all this ticket validation through ServiceNow, and it's only when I actually put a valid ticket in place that I gain access to this system. So I can click in here now, and this is when I click open this remote desktop protocol session. We're now proxying this session to the server, to this domain controller. Now if you remember, the only password that I've actually had to put in is my login credentials to my standard user password. And when the user now connects with this domain admin credential, I'm hitting the domain controller. My password is going to be injected into that session on my behalf. I don't need to know what that password is. I don't need to know what that credential is. And what we're also doing now is, because we're proxying this session, we can do full session recording. We can also do full keystroke logging along with this. So there you go. You may have seen that my user, the account that was used there, if you can't see, it doesn't pop it on there. So if I just do, who am I? There we go. We can see that I'm actually logged into that system now as domain admin 1, but I actually didn't need to see what that credential was. So we've got the video recording, everything taking place, the keystroke login. I'm actually just going to leave that session up and running for a moment and just jump back to my home page and also connect to a Linux endpoint. So again, I could go through this process, put in a request if needed, and I'm just going to do an SSH session to a Linux endpoint. Again, I could have checked out that password if I wanted to, but instead I'd rather just be connected directly to the server. And connecting through there, I've now got access to that server. My privileged credentials for that Linux machine were just injected on my behalf. I didn't need to know what those credentials were. Now, the reason why I wanted to connect to the Linux endpoint as well is, yes, we're doing all the video recording, we're doing all the keystroke logging. So if I start putting in commands, the keystrokes are also being logged here. But what we can also do within SSH sessions is actual keystroke violation. So what we can do here is we're effectively blacklisting certain commands from being put into, typed in here. So for instance, I put a keystroke violation in place if the user types FTP. So maybe we don't want the user to type FTP, and you can see here, I can't actually run that command, and at the top here you can see that the keyword violation, and what's happened is the session's been blocked. So I can go backwards, but if I do start typing in things that we shouldn't, we can block that session. Now that's a block. I can take away or delete that command and start typing again, anything that I want to. But what we can also do is put in locks as well. So if we don't want the user to be able to shut down one of those machines, this is actually now lock the session also. So I now can't do anything here. I need to have a conversation with one of the password safe administrators, because what I do now is if I jump back to an administrator and log into that same portal, so the same portal that my standard user or my sysadmin logged into, I'm logging in now as a password safe administrator. Based on my role, it's all role-based access. I can now see more of the configuration side, the analytics and reporting, etc., etc. What I can do is, if I move down here, I can actually go and view active sessions. So I'm logged in as one of the password safe administrators. I can see what was going on the domain controller. So the user there that's connected to the domain controller, I can see exactly what's going on there. We can see all the keystrokes, etc., and the actions that were performed. And if I go to my Linux session, the SSH session, I can see here that it's currently locked. So I have the option to unlock that. So I could unlock it and allow them to continue with their work, or I could terminate that session, or even terminate that session and cancel that request. So we've got this control, but I'm quite happy just to unlock the session. So now that user can go back and continue with the work. So the user was happy. They've took the advice from the person that's told them what they shouldn't be shutting down that server. And what they do now is they go back and they can check in their request. So at this check-in point now, what we've done is that credential that I never knew, I didn't know the actual password for those credentials. That credential is now checked back in to our password safe and rotated in accordance to our password policy. And these password policies can be anything from a few, however many characters you need, up to 128 complex characters. So we can actually meet what your Active Directory password policy may be. As well as, let's see how we're doing for time. So 34 minutes, so I've got 10 minutes left. So as well as being able to view active sessions, if I just sign out of here, one of the things that we can also do, So just check that session back in. So I'm finished with my session on my domain controller now, so I've checked that in, and again, that domain controller, that password that was used is checked back into the safe and rotated in accordance to the that password policy. If I go back to my server that I'm logged into as the administrator now, as well as being able to see the active sessions, we can also replay sessions. So from an auditing point of view, here we can see today's we've got my connection to my to the Linux server and the DC, the accounts that we used, the times, etc., the duration. And if I jump in here, you can actually open up those recorded sessions. These are the actual recorded sessions during that privileged access. One thing that I just wanted to touch on finally is not just how I mentioned before about the myth that it's a very expensive cost and a lot of consultancy effort that's required in order for you to onboard assets and get all these privileged accounts under management. But one of the things that we do, want to pride ourselves within BeyondTrust is how we actually do the initial onboarding and discovery of assets out there and the privileged accounts that may sit on those assets and also within your Active Directory. So what we do is we have the ability to scan the network to identify assets, and that's an important thing. We're not just looking within an Active Directory for machines that are domain joined. We're literally talking about any asset that is on your network, and that can be Windows devices, domain joined machines, Linux endpoints, Mac endpoints, things such as routers, switches, anything that sits on the network that actually has an IP address. The way that we do that is through the assets part. We go and run a scan. So if I came to do a POC or a pilot with you, what we would do is we'd stick our appliance on the network, we'd give it an IP address, and then what we would do is we'd do a discovery scan. So in here, we just basically go in, select an IP address or an IP address range, more importantly, hit scan, and it would go away and discover all of the assets that exist within that network, that IP address range. It then will bring back some information. It'll bring back limited information to start, because what it'll do is it'll just bring back information such as computer names, maybe DNS names, IP addresses. But then what we do is we use what we call functional accounts. Functional accounts that can do deeper scans on these discovered devices. So if you think of a functional account for a Windows endpoint, would be an account that has admin permissions on that endpoint. So it would be able to not just scan the machine, but actually delve deeper and just pull back more information from that asset. The reason why we would want to do that is if I take my app01, apologies, it's not very clear at the moment, but all I wanted to show you there is that with these functional scans, what we'll do is, or these deeper scans, we're not just about identifying things such as the user accounts that exist on those endpoints. So here we've discovered a number of accounts that are on the machine. They could be local accounts, domain accounts, all with different privileges. So it's telling me there these are administrator privileges, the password age, what groups those accounts sit in. But it isn't just, as I said, not just the human accounts. We also have service accounts out there that are running with privileged credentials. Probably those accounts that have got the very high number of days until they were previously changed and scheduled tasks, etc. It's not just these human accounts, but also the non-human accounts that we need to be concerned with. So what we've done there is we've discovered these assets, we've discovered the accounts, but then what do we do? How do we onboard them? Well, what we do in BeyondTrust is we talk about smart rules. And smart rules are basically simple ways for us to group together assets and to group together privileged accounts. So here, for example, I've got a smart rule in place that's going to discover my Windows application servers. So what we do is we create matching criteria. So we've got different types of criteria that we can use. We can look at the operating system type. We can look at things such as asset fields, assigned attributes, etc., etc. Basically giving you that ability to group together or identify similar assets that are out there that you want to manage in the same way. So then any servers that match this criteria, what we're going to do? Well, what we're going to do, we want to manage it within password safe. with a particular platform type and with these particular password rules. So then what that means is any new endpoint that joins the network, that just appears on our network, that matches that criteria, we will automatically onboard that asset and manage it in the same way. And we'll then do exactly the same thing for the accounts that we identify on those endpoints. So what we can do is we're looking for the accounts in there. We're using the same types of smart rules to say, well, great. Well, actually, if we've onboarded some Linux endpoints, what I then want to do is any of the accounts that exist on those Linux endpoints that maybe match a particular privilege that is either administrator or root level, I want to onboard those and manage those within our password safe. I want to manage those account settings to my 128 character rule and maybe rotate that password every 30 days or every time that that credential is used and checked back in to the password vault. So that makes the management of assets and the credentials much simpler. You create these smart rules once, and then any new devices that join the network can automatically be onboarded. Any new credentials that exist on those assets can automatically be onboarded. Any new credentials that land within a particular area within your Active Directory, if we create some new admin accounts, someone joins the business, they've got their own dedicated ADM account, we can put rules in place that automatically map those dedicated admin accounts to the user's standard logon account. So very simple from a management point of view. And then, as I said, it's all role-based access. So what we're going to do is we can, based on maybe Active Directory security groups, you can see here, I'm part of the Tier 3 sysadmins. I'm the only person actually in that tier. But if you can see, what we've done there is we've created these smart rules, so based on assets and based on credentials. So I can just go in here and say, yeah, well, anybody that's part of the third line sysadmins, I want to give them access to the Linux privileged accounts, the Windows accounts, the domain admin accounts. And because that user is someone that needs to request access, I could be a requester, I could be someone that approves these requests. And then based on the fact that I want to be a requester, what's the access policy? Do we want to have an auto approve or maybe a single approver in there? And what's the access? When do we want to give someone access to these systems? What we can do here is we can control that completely. It could be maybe on a daily basis, start dates, end dates. Maybe we want to give a different access or at least different approval process when someone is trying to access a privileged asset when they're on the company premises, but then when they're off the company premises, maybe we want to put some approval process in place. Here through the access schedule, you can actually control whether we're doing the recordings, keystroke logging, the approval process, and what types of access do we want to give them? Do we want to make it more secure and actually control the proxy of the actual session itself and inject the credentials, or do you just want to allow someone to be able to view a password and check that password in and out? So I had a wave at the back there showing I was 5 minutes up. Happy to run through any more technical demonstrations. We're just over in the corner, just next to the main hall. Hopefully you can see that it's not just about managing privileged credentials. There's a whole lot more to privileged access. I've just shown you today more of that privileged access management, the session management and the password management with the rotation of the credentials and actually controlling that session itself, pushing it through our portal, giving the ability to do the session recording, keystroke logging of that privileged session. But as we said, there's a lot more to it. There's also the thoughts of the removal of admin rights completely. So reducing the attack surface by taking away admin rights and actually implementing things such as whitelisting. And we're also securing that third-party access with the privileged remote access. So thanks for your time today, everybody. If you do have any questions, I'll be sticking around, but thank you very much for joining me. Thanks.